Hello everyone, and welcome to MOOCs by Design. This is a week-long webinar series offered by Penn State's Teaching and Learning with Technology unit and is intended to discuss the 5 key phases of massive open online course creation. Over the course of this week, we're going to be featuring sessions devoted to planning, which happened yesterday, design, which is today, development, delivery, and finally, evaluation. My name is Brad Zdenek, and I'm with the Center for Online Innovation and Learning here at Penn State. I'll be helping to relay your question to the presenters. I have the honor of introducing our speakers for today, and I'll be serving as your host for the next 90 minutes. Before we get started, though, there are a few pieces of housekeeping to take care of. It's really important to us that we have an engaging discussion today, so we ask that if you have any questions whatsoever, please go into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, type in your questions, ask whatever you would like, and then what I will do is I'll relay those questions to the presenters when there's an opportunity. If you have a question that you're maybe not particularly comfortable with asking in public, you can also privately chat me in order to ask the question, and then I'll relay it anonymously to our speakers. To do that, simply hover your mouse over my name, Brad Zdenek, over on the left-hand side of your screen. When you hover over my name, you'll see an option that says Start Private Chat. From there, start a private chat, type in your question, submit it, and then I'll ask it at the first opportunity. Finally, if you're experiencing any technical issues, feel free to also use the chat box to ask for help. Jim Salvaggio, who you also see on the left-hand side of the screen, our technical guru, will help out as best as he can. I'll also jump in to provide any assistance possible. I also put in a few tips if you're having any audio issues at the very top of the chat box. So, with that taken care of, today we're going to be continuing our discussion with a focus on the design phase of MOOCs. And we're lucky enough to have with us 3 seasoned pros from here at Penn State. Leading us through the discussion today is Kate Miffett, Director of Digital Media, Pedagogy, and Scholarship in the College of Liberal Arts here at Penn State. She's joined by Carrie Chin, Interim Director of Penn State's eLearning Institute and lead for the Instructional Design and Development team on Penn State's Introduction to Art Concept and Techniques MOOC. Rounding out our presenters, we have with us Crystal Ramsey, Research Associate and Instructional Consultant at Penn State's Schreier Institute for Teaching Excellence. So with our introductions out of the way, I'll hand the reins off to Kate to get us started. Kate?
Thank you, Brad. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about the design phase of MOOC development. And as with all projects, a solid design plan is essential to developing a quality MOOC. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on a traditional, orienting you to an instructional design process, but rather we're going to be spending the bulk of our talk focusing on the design challenges that we encountered particular to MOOCs. So with that, we'll get started with the objectives. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of things. First, we're going to identify considerations of designing for the diverse learner audience in MOOCs. Second, we'll discuss the role of alignment as it pertains to course and lesson design. And finally, we'll have an open discussion about strategies to address MOOC-specific challenges to the design process. So before we get into the first section of our talk, we wanted to provide a little context regarding the MOOCs that both Gary and I worked on, so you have some context for some of the examples we'll refer to as we get started.
Afternoon, everyone. This is Gary Chin. The MOOC that we worked on here at Penn State that rolled out about a year ago, actually it opened in the middle of May of 2013, was called Introduction to Art, Concepts and Techniques. It was a 7-week course and relied on a series of quizzes, which is very common in MOOCs. One of the things that we were interested in experimenting with that particular MOOC was adding a made art component to the class. So there were 5 optional made art assignments. There were some differences in the statements of accomplishment that I'll get into later when we talk about more of the details of what we are going to cover today. There are a couple of different pathways for students to take. Videos and readings were the bulk of the content presentation, and our enrollments were somewhere north of 60,000 with around 10% completion rate.
And so this is Kate speaking, and I was the lead designer on the Creativity, Innovation, and Change MOOC. This course was actually sponsored by the College of Engineering, and at the time of its development, I was working in a central IT organization called Education Technology Services. Our team looked a bit like, we had 3 faculty members on the team, several consultants, 1 instructional designer, and then a group of PhD students in education and some undergraduate students from our IST program, so computer science majors, who helped the development efforts of the course. The course was 8 weeks long, and our assessments included a weekly quiz and reflection, which took the form of so it utilized the quiz format, but it was really more like reflection or survey type questions, exercises that were ungraded and they really happened offline, and then discussions and an optional project. The content was actually fairly thin. We only did about maybe a little bit more than 20 minutes worth of lecture content a week. That was primarily supplemented by external resources, so TED Talks, YouTube videos, readings, and so on. And for those out there that are into the numbers game with MOOCs, we had over 120,000 enrollments, but a fairly low completion rate. But we did make use of Coursera's signature track, which we had a number of people complete. So with that, we're going to transition to one section of our talk today entitled The Problem of Audience. So typically in higher ed, when we're designing online courses, we can make certain assumptions about our learners because of the learning environment that we're operating in. So regardless of how diverse your student body is, there is a level of homogenization that occurs because of the admissions process. That coupled with curricular goals and accreditation standards, there are just certain expectations in place about the level of rigor and motivation of students and a number of other variables. So we kind of skip the whole needs assessment phase of the instructional design process, essentially. And after that process, students are funneled into a really rich learning environment. So we have a number of tools that are at our disposal, both university supported and just out there on the web, to create really rich active learning experiences. So for many of us in instructional design, that's sort of our orientation to online course development. When you go into the MOOC design environment, however, you're facing quite the opposite in terms of design conditions. So you're really facing probably the most diverse learner audience that you'll have ever encountered with, and there's some stats represented here, but with students from over 195 different countries with varying levels of language proficiency and background education, it's really hard to gauge who it is that you're designing for. And then these students are being brought into the MOOC learning environment, which based on reasons of scale, have limited assessment options. So we're, primarily able to create video. Video is the primary content type. And then in terms of assessment types, we're limited by the quizzes and peer assessment models, and then the discussion forums. So clearly the conditions of MOOCs present a certain number of specific challenges that we'll unpack a little bit further.
So one of the constraints in regards to the problem of audience that I'm going to talk about and use a lot of examples from the Art MOOC that we created was the issue of language. And in terms of the problem of audience, the approach that I like to take is sort of each of these kind of subtopics, thinking through what you're designing for based on what the challenge is. So in the question of language, it's really designing for diversity of proficiency of language. So it probably makes sense to everyone that we created an English language MOOC here at Penn State. But I wanted to go over a little bit of what the differences were for the MOOC students versus the profile of our usual Penn State student. So on the left-hand side here, you see resident enrollments as a percentage, and we're looking at over 90% of our enrollments are from the United States. World Campus, which is Penn State's very large and active online learning arm, enrolling somewhere around 16,000 completely online students, has a very similar profile. They're actually even more domestic than the resident. But if you look at the Coursera enrollments in the Art MOOC, you're getting pretty close to flipping the percentages, where the overwhelming majority of the students who are enrolled are not from the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not native English speakers, but it obviously makes it less likely that they are native English speakers. So we're looking at this fundamentally different field of play, where the population, the student population in the class, is over 3/4 outside the United States. A little bit more of a breakdown of country of origin. This isn't all of the countries of origin, but I thought this was interesting to look at. The United States being this yellow band on the upper right. Some of the other countries that are well represented are India, Russian Federation, Brazil, Spain, Mexico. And it kind of moves on down from there. And, for the visually oriented, this is a map of the top 10 countries of origin that attended the Art MOOC that we created. So this is all a long way of saying that designing for language consideration is different, even from other online courses. Penn State's World Campus courses are credit-bearing. They typically enroll somewhere on the order of 20 to 30 students per section, so they're much closer in that regard to a traditional resident enrollment. So what are the kinds of things, if you're designing for language diversity, and again, a lot of the things we're going to talk about today are a little bit unknown. There are some clues out there in terms of the information that Coursera can provide. University of Michigan is providing data on their Coursera MOOCs. edX has a whole white paper series on the demographic profiles of the people who are consuming who are enrolling in their MOOCs. And so it's very likely that if you're aspiring to create a MOOC, or your institution already creates them, and you're trying to figure out what is likely to be the profile, the learner profile, you can get some ideas of what the demographic profile is going to look like. But how does it change things? So one of the things that we tried to collect data on early on from the course was English proficiency. This slide talks a little bit about self-reporting of proficiency in writing and reading from the students. And you can see that there's a diversity here as well in terms of our course and then relative to the other Coursera courses. So what we're looking at is a bit of an unknown in general when you're going into the class. Obviously, this information we didn't have until the class was underway. This was part of the initial survey, initial course survey. Why it was relevant for us is because in the world of art, and a lot of the Art MOOC had to do with art history, art critique, and in the art making side, there was very specific terminology for techniques as well. So words mean something very specific in the context of this course, and this is going to be very likely to be the case of any MOOC that you design. There's going to be terminology or jargon or language that's specific. This is a screen cap of one of our videos. One of the ways that we tried to approach this language issue is to provide definitions and additional information whenever we could. And this is one of the ways we did it. In the videos themselves that were narrated, when the words were spoken, there would be definition information that appeared on screen as well. One of the things that's really interesting about art and terminology is even if people are proficient at English, it's common that the words in art contexts can be words they're already familiar with, but that mean fundamentally different things. So, for example, value means something different in art critique than it means more broadly. Shade is another example. Hatching is another example. So, are these all these terms that students from other countries may have had some familiarity with, but they mean something fundamentally different in the context of this class. In addition to the video terms, one of the other things that we really tried to do was provide a central place for terms in case students got lost or if they wanted to refresh. So we built a as an aspect of the persistent navigation of the course, we built a glossary. And this screen cap is an example of hatching. And what we were able to do for many of the examples is provide a visual that accompanied the definitions as well. So as you can imagine, it's difficult to describe art techniques using only words. So the hope was that in combination, the videos and the terms on screen together and providing a more robust multimedia glossary, that we could move the students toward a better understanding. At least they'd have resources that they could go to address this, the language challenges. I mentioned early on in the profile of the course there that we had some made art assignments. Those of you who are familiar with MOOCs are going to know this already, but by far the dominant kind of process for any kind of made project, be it a written paper or an assignment or presentation, is going to be peer assessment by peer students because of the numbers. Basically, it's just not feasible for instructors to be grading all of those. One of the great challenges of MOOCs. So again, in the spirit of helping support the learners from the language side, from the language diversity side, we also try to design some rubrics to support their peer assessments of one another. And we had some pre-existing rubrics for evaluating and critiquing art that we basically had to strip down and reconsider at a lower level of reading proficiency to make sure that we could provide something that was useful and would accommodate that sort of unknown diversity of language. So this is an example of one of the rubrics that was used for peer assessment within the class on the 5 made art assignments.
So the next big variable with respect to designing a MOOC is determining the appropriate level of rigor. So again, when you're designing for a traditional online environment in higher ed, you have a good sense of what the targeted level of rigor is, and there are certain conditions in place, like the length of the semester and so on, that help you define that in some way. With MOOCs, it's pretty wide open. So one of the challenges that I encountered when we first started designing the Creativity MOOC was really getting the faculty to reorient their perspective of time and the type of content they wanted to cover from a traditional semester-length course to something that might be a little bit more of a teaser, more appropriate for audiences with different levels of motivation and interest in the topic. So I mentioned earlier there were 3 lead faculty who were each bringing their research areas in creativity and trying to synthesize this down into one experience. So their original idea was that they would create a 12-week course. But we know from Coursera data that 12 weeks, there's the persistence, doesn't really, you don't see a lot of retention through longer courses. So we are trying to balance both what the faculty wanted to cover and the learning objectives against the medium and what makes the most sense for the audiences that are attracted to these experiences. So we refined the course down to an 8-week course. So I think the rigor question raises a number of considerations to just think about as you're beginning a design process. First is certainly identifying your learning objectives and what is an appropriate level of rigor and length of time to cover that content or to meet those objectives. And then to consider who is the target audience for this experience. Each of the faculty that I worked with in the Creativity MOOC had a certain audience that they had worked with. So for example, one faculty member did a lot of work in K-12. Another did a lot of consulting with the military. So these were very diverse groups that they wanted to make the course work for. So I think, and then the other thing is to think about what sort of learning activities meet the objectives and how difficult you want those to be for the audience. So for the creativity course, they really wanted to incorporate elements of play and self-reflection. And so having rigorous assessments that would be, objectively graded was not really appealing to them. So I pulled a sample from their grading policy that demonstrates how they were really focused on the broad goal of personal creative growth. So they were not determining assessment measures in a traditional sense, but really that they were relying on a self-assessment model for the course. And the criteria for earning a certificate was pretty minimal. The learners just had to complete the quizzes and self-reflections I identified in the summary of the course design. And those were pretty easy to pass. They were not high-stakes assessments in any way. So I think the rigor is one of the bigger challenges when you're designing, to think about, what is the appropriate level of difficulty.
So a related concept in terms of accommodating, I think one of the common threads here with the session and when designing in MOOCs in general is a lot of these design decisions are trying to accommodate the unknown a little bit. It's again, in the spirit of the problem of audience, it's the unknown and very, very heterogeneous nature of the audience. There's a lot to be said for, or there's a counter argument you can make that there is a certain profile of MOOC students that's highly educated, and I think they're over 70% as bachelor's degree holders and things like that. But I think based on the experiences that we've had and the data that's coming back, even given the similarities that do exist, it creates fundamentally different design challenges for people who build courses and build learning experiences. So a related one to the rigor question is the issue of motivation, and really that's designing for the variety of wants and expectations that students might have. And so what are some of the ways that you can design MOOCs that kind of try to offer a variety of pathways to students, because they're very unlikely to come in wanting similar things. So again, in the using the example of the Art MOOC that we worked on, one of the pathways that we tried to kind of play with was a variety of statements of accomplishment. And Coursera has some of these. They have the signature track, which is a whole different kind of animal, and they have now these collections of courses that are even beyond just an individual course that you can sort of put together or package together, sequences I think they're called, or series. But what we tried to do is kind of offer two flavors of statements of accomplishment that broke things out into the art history portion of the course, which really was covered by machine-graded quizzes, and what we considered to be more of a studio statement of accomplishment, which included the art history piece, but added the layer of made art and peer assessment of other students' art. So this language sort of specs out what the expectations were to meet those different bars. And the idea was that we would be offering students an easier and a more challenging way to navigate through the course, but also admitting that there may very well be some students who don't really want to make things, and maybe they just want to pick up things here and there. And it's possible that there would be students who only want to make things, and that we'd have to sort of drag them along through the art history portion, because the art history portion did inform the assignments. They weren't completely separated out, so there was some curricular cohesion there. The introductory video talked about the two tracks, and that either could result in statement of accomplishment. One was a much greater time commitment. If you can imagine, making original works of art takes quite a bit more time than simply finishing a 20-item quiz every week. So that was something that we wanted to give them a heads up early on. I think that's a good practice, if you can do it, is make it very clear from the beginning that there are options available to them, but what are going to be the consequences of choosing A versus B. This is just an example of what the with distinction looks like. You get an extra little banner on there. You can probably imagine what the standard one looks like. It looks just like that without the blue banner. But that was, the approach that we took to try to accommodate this notion that people were going to come to the class with fundamentally different expectations. And I think one of the other interesting things based on the pre-course survey is the percentage of students who had no expectation of finishing at all. It's I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's a pretty significant group of students who really are just coming with this notion that they're going to explore a little bit, but not necessarily want to do something as formal as complete the requirements for a statement of accomplishment.
And before we transition to accessibility, one of the benefits of going after the first MOOC at Penn State was that we got to borrow the Art MOOC's model of using the 2 tracks to meet this variability in motivation. So the Creativity MOOC created this little metaphor. So they had tourists, travelers, and adventurers, and the tourists were the kind of a way to identify that you just thought you might drop in here and there and just access content, whereas the other 2 were kind of little cute names for the statement of accomplishment and then the one with distinction. And similarly, it had a project component for the distinction track, which we can talk a little bit more about at the end. But with regard to accessibility, this was another area that I think was surprising. So, and I'm using the term accessibility in the broadest sense because with such a diverse audience, I think we were surprised by the needs that were articulated and the things that people expressed in the course. So I think that the general takeaway here is that by designing for accessibility, you're meeting the needs of more audiences than you think than we typically identify as having accessibility requirements. So this isn't just about compliance. Here's a couple of just quotes from the discussion forum. So you can see accessibility means a number of different things in this environment. So one is bandwidth issues. So some of the videos weren't accessible for users in certain countries based on their bandwidth or the device that they were using. So making available transcripts of all the videos made it really more usable for those groups. For those for whom English isn't their first language, I think the transcripts also helped them with comprehension and working at their own pace. And finally, some people just prefer the transcripts for their own workflow. Perhaps they're working out of their office, or they just like reading over watching the videos. So making your course accessible and meeting accessibility requirements meets the needs of a number of different users and not simply those who we traditionally think of as requiring accessibility.
So this one, in terms of a design goal, we had a little bit some conversation about what to call it, and we wound up with extend. But the idea here is if you're in the mindset of we're extending for, or we're designing for blank, right? In this case, we're trying to design MOOCs so that they can have a life beyond the end of the actual course. This, I think, is a really intriguing aspect of MOOCs that make them a little bit different from, again, the temporally bound, even online courses that are semester-based or kind of these cohort-based. Doesn't get fully into sort of an open educational resource model, although I know that there's a public health course from Michigan that sort of is trying to, that's a Coursera course originally that's kind of trying to push that a little bit. But I think this is another really interesting part of MOOCs, is this notion that you can build something in the design of the course itself that facilitates kind of almost a launching off into other areas so that the community that forms around the MOOC can have a place to go once the class is over. So what are some of the ways that we tried to do that? We tried very explicitly from the very beginning to have some opportunities for students to share what they were going to be making. I mean, we knew from the outset that students were going to be creating original works of art. We didn't know how many, but we were confident with the number of enrollments they had that we'd have some, right? We'd have a couple of people at least try to make some artwork and share it. So we tried to make it as easy as possible to give them, so almost provision some social media buckets, if you will, for them to place their original works of art that were outside the walls of the Coursera course. So Twitter, we had a hashtag for the course. We had a very active Facebook page of right around 6,000 students, which actually was, right at 10% of our registrations, which was, and I don't know that everybody who was in the Facebook group was actually in the course, because you can't really know that for sure, but it was a very active space with a lot of sharing. I have some images I can share in a second. And then we had a Flickr tag as well for people who wanted to share in more of a kind of an image-based social media area. And on the left-hand side here, these are basically the pulled together Twitter hashtags of some of the student works from around the world. On the right-hand side, that's our Facebook group. That's just the wall, the public wall of our Facebook group. I think this allowed students to kind of, obviously this is all opt-in. Nobody was required to post anything publicly, but it was an opportunity for them to move beyond the kind of little bit of a walled garden of a Coursera course. If they had built something and submitted it, those images were only going to be seen within the course by their peer assessors. So these avenues for sharing outside of the Coursera platform were for people who are interested in such things. And it led to some really great conversations. I can say that the Facebook group was very encouraging toward one another. I think one of the things that's kind of seems to have consistently come up with at least the Penn State MOOCs is that the forums can sometimes be the forums in Coursera are not overwhelmingly positive all the time. There are some bad actors in there, as you'd expect when you get tens of thousands of people together. But one of the things that I thought was really exciting about the Facebook group was that was overwhelmingly positive. Students sharing their work and everyone being, by and large, very encouraging toward one another. And as you can probably tell, even from this clip, we had a great diversity of accomplishment in terms of art skills, which was another thing that you can't really necessarily design for because you can't keep people out. But to Kate's point of the sort of the admissions process being a gatekeeper for regular courses, we had professional artists all the way down to complete novices in there together. That has its minuses at times, with novices feeling maybe possibly a little intimidated, but it also has this great upside if people are acting in a supportive way to encourage one another. And then this I just thought was a great kind of a screen cap of a comment from the forums. Their students started planning their next move before our class ended. So I think this was maybe a couple of weeks before the class wrapped up, and there were 3 or 4 of these different proposed places where they could go next to continue sharing ideas and feedback with one another, and kind of there was a Google Plus groups that evolved. There were also Facebook groups that were private, that were based around either language or just smaller groups that we didn't have access to. We know they exist, but we didn't think it was appropriate to try and get admission into those to peek to see what they were talking about. But I think, again, this is all something that is somewhat unique to the MOOC phenomenon, in that, to use a bad analogy of water, so the water is flowing somewhere, and then once the course is over, where does it go? And are there things that you can do when designing the course to kind of provide logical places so that the students don't have to figure all of that out themselves? And I think the exciting thing too is that if you do that and they go there, it becomes a persistent place where you can revisit and see how things evolve. So our Facebook group is still active. You can join if you are interested. It's continuing on without us because we haven't announced our second offering of the Art MOOC yet. So designing for extending beyond is another aspect of MOOC design.
And I think with regards to this idea of extending beyond the MOOC environment, the Creativity MOOC did a very similar efforts with respect to using social media, and so where we saw a lot of interest was in Google+. So we had regular Google Hangouts where the faculty would have synchronous discussions, and then those would be made available to others to watch later on. But I think because of that active use of Google Hangout, our Google Plus community was really active. We also used LinkedIn, and because of the nature of the group project the course project, which was to employ a creative design process to a project of your own creation. A number of students created websites using WordPress, and they were sharing their design plans in social media as much as they were within the discussion forums in the course. So two interesting examples, I think, of products from these creative projects. The first is this Created Venture, which is a group of K-12 educators who found each other in the MOOC and are interested in introducing creativity into K-12 classrooms. So I think, a lot of the narrative around MOOCs focus on the large enrollment numbers, and what's interesting are these anecdotes that emerge where you can see that these learning experiences can have a high impact on people. Here's another feature article, What Happens After the MOOC Ends, which shares a story of this woman who created this company, Successify, as a result of taking this MOOC. So again, it's a really nice outcome that couldn't have been predicted when we started designing, but was a nice success story that happened outside of the context of the MOOC itself. So I think to synthesize a little bit about what we're talking about today, again, when we're designing for traditional online learning experiences, however strange it may sound to use the word traditional in that context, we're most often approaching our work trying to be creative within the box. So we're designing for a 3-credit course, for a 16-week semester, to meet the curricular goals of the X department. And so you're looking for creative ways to do interactive learning or create engaging experiences for learners. With MOOCs, there really is no box. And so I think by articulating some of these design challenges, it's a call to perhaps identify and create some of your own constraints to help make the design process a little bit more smooth. So I think the key takeaway is simply to identify a target audience that you're making some of your decisions for that align to your goals, so that it creates some constraint while you're still trying to build in flexibility to meet the needs of most users. And some examples of how to think about that. So for one example is, if your goal at an institutional level is to generate interest in online programs, as was one of ours at Penn State with the Maps in Geospatial Revolution course. This was a great example of a course that mapped directly to an online program. So that really helps to determine some of those factors that were mentioned. You would want to design for the same level of rigor that the program is at, so that students know what they're getting themselves into. And you want the content to be representative of what the learning experience would be like in the online program. So that creates some of those constraints and makes the design process a little bit easier when you're faced with some decisions. Another example is if your goal is outreach or to create a public good. Now, I'm only guessing at what the goals of this course is, but it seems in particular that with the courses related to activism or nonprofits or public health that were on Coursera, those really speak to an audience of practitioners, and I heard at the first Coursera Partners Conference of an example where it really helped to support groups who are doing efforts on the ground in places like Africa and India. So there, I think it helps to help inform some design challenges if you're thinking about the goal in terms of outreach and helping professionals. Finally, if the goal is to increase brand awareness, now again, I know there's a number of people from Duke in the session, so I'm only guessing at what the objective was, but this is one of my favorite MOOCs, was the Guide to Irrational Behavior. And some of the things that I think were exceptional about it was you have a very charismatic faculty member, a very interesting topic that I think has broad appeal to a popular audience. And then there were certain really nice choices made with regards to the production where there's nice shots of campus. And so I think it was a great experience just for a broad audience, and it really helps to increase brand awareness. So those are some considerations to think of if that's one of your goals at an institutional level. So we'll take a break here for questions before we transition to the next section.
So we had a few questions come in on private chat, and one of them, rewinding a little bit, and Gary, you were talking about this. You were talking about some of the issues related to cultural awareness and how you have to have that cultural awareness during the design process. Were there any support services in place, or were there any services you can leverage here at Penn State for avoiding potential cultural misunderstanding? Did you focus groups? Did you leverage the international community here at the university? Most instructional designers, I think, maybe are not experts in this. Right. How do you navigate that in a MOOC environment?
Yeah, I can say, so the short answer is that no, we did not. The longer answer would be we probably should have. And we've learned a lot of those similar lessons. So one just real quick example is that we did not involve an academic librarian in our design team for our course, which in retrospect seems silly and very bad planning. But I think we're probably not alone in, especially in the context of early design teams around MOOCs, is, I think everyone defaults into maybe taking the approaches that they're used to. And what I hope people get from this session is that the kinds of audience diversity probably does change the team formation too. So we do have an excellent Office of Global Programs here that we did not involve, but I think that's a spectacular idea. The only thing that I can really speak to that we saw that I would consider to be sort of culturally related issue was around the peer assessments and different people. And again, this is just my perception, our team's perception, our read on it. Some students seemed uncomfortable with peer assessment relative to others in terms of maybe not wanting to be critical, not wanting to assign bad scores, and there were some complaints from students about the scores they received back being overly harsh and maybe inappropriate by their standards. And so I think there was a cultural component to that. I don't know the exact nature of it, but I think that would be it would be great to involve them. I think that the messy part becomes how specifically someone from almost like a global programs office perspective, if they do join the team, how specifically are they able to plug in on the design side?
Actually, and that's a perfect segue to the other question that came in, which is what types of feedback did you receive regarding the peer assessment element? In practice, how relevant or how valuable was it for us as an assessment technique within the MOOC? Yeah.
So the peer assessment aspect of the course is far and away the most interesting in terms of the statistics related to the feedback that we got. So we have a great research arm for our MOOCs here who provided us with a great deal of information, pre and post course survey data, demographic data. And one of the things that they gave us was a ranking of the student perceptions of the usefulness, almost like a student satisfaction related to different course aspects. So rated very highly were videos, the art assignments. The art assignments themselves were rated very highly. Quizzes were mostly positive. The fascinating thing about the peer assessments is that it was split 50-50. People liked them or hated them. And so it's this very polarizing process, or it's this very polarizing dimension of our MOOC I'm actually really interested in kind of comparing it. I haven't had the opportunity to compare it to the other Penn State MOOCs that also had peer assessment activities. But for us, it came back sort of the only aspect of the course that was polarized that way. And I think there are a lot of reasons for it. It would be fascinating to dig into them. We could explore calibrating the reviewers and improving things. But I think, it's certainly one of the more complex aspects of MOOCs that would really benefit from a lot of time and care if you want to build peer assessments that make sense and are useful to students.
Thanks. There was one more question that came in, but I think it's better left for a little bit later in the session, so I'll get back to that for the individual that asked that question. But for now, I think we're going to be moving on to Crystal Ramsey for her section of the presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I've been sitting here listening to the whole conversation and happy to join in at this point. And my task today is to kind of talk a little bit about assessment. And it's been alluded to a whole lot in the past hour. And in particular, I want to focus on the idea of alignment, which is a topic that Kate has alluded to in particular with respect to rigor. I don't think she's used that word, but that's really what she's been talking about, is thinking deeply about the extent of rigor and how it aligns with the goals of a MOOC and so forth. And she and Gary have both talked about some different assessment strategies in MOOCs, peer review, with the options and tracks and whether people participate in made art and how they get feedback on that, quizzes and so forth. So we've been alluding a lot to it over the last hour, but what I wanted to do and what I'm sort of tasked with here is, excuse me, thinking a little more deeply about assessment per se as a design element when MOOCs are being really conceptualized and put together. And so in most instructional settings, whether a MOOC or a more traditional online course or a face-to-face context, we really assess for 4 reasons. So one is to determine whether students learn what we intended them to learn, to increase learning and motivation, and plenty of research suggests that assessments of various sorts do increase both, collect feedback about how we're doing as instructors, and then to provide data about the quality and success of our course. And that's sort of the accountability piece. If somebody wants to know about how we're doing as instructors, how our students are doing, we can provide data. So what assessment looks like in face-to-face and even many online contexts can really be quite diverse, and there's a big range of options. But when course design gets scaled up to MOOCs, that can change a little and can look a little different. And I think it was Gary who said earlier, or Kate, we're fairly limited in the ways we can assess when you have 125,000 people enrolled in a course. That can be kind of challenging. And so we know we can use peer assessment. Gary, given what you just said about your comments about peer review, I think it is Stanford University that's done a fair amount of research on actually looking at peer assessment and doing some high-level statistical maneuvering to allow people to feel good about, almost like a formulaic kind of thing so there's some really interesting stuff that's been done around peer assessment. At any rate, so there's peer assessment, online quizzes, social media, sort of discussion forums and so forth, but they're still kind of limited. And whether or not these original purposes, the idea of trying to figure out what students, if they've learned what we've intended, whether those various reasons we assess hold true in MOOCs is in large part related to the function of the MOOC at all. And Kate was just talking about some of those goals. And just to kind of get at what I mean by that, if MOOC purpose really drives the nature of assessment. So for example, if the purpose of it is outreach, sending out information to a broad audience where maybe prior knowledge doesn't matter very much. Anybody can kind of join in. The focus is on generating interest, getting a lot of people to kind of stay the course and stick it out. Then assessment is a little less of an issue, and Kate talked about that in the Creativity, Innovation, and Change MOOC, where personal creative growth was one of the big objectives of the whole thing. Assessment looks different, for example, than if, ultimately, to the extent we might look at MOOCs as an alternative credentialing kind of option for people, where MOOCs are for credit, and it matters who joins in, and that entering into a MOOC is a function of prerequisite knowledge. That stuff becomes really important, and assessment of learning really applies. So that if somebody would want to know, well, did you learn this, that, or the other thing in the MOOC that you took, being able to say with some confidence that yes, completion equaled learning, that can be a little bit trickier, I think. So at any rate, what I wanted to do is to kind of make that assumption that to the extent that we really want our assessments to be about what students have learned, then a fundamental concept becomes this idea of alignment. And so I think it's a useful thing to talk about with respect to assessment as part of MOOC design, but also this is kind of a great way to see this session sort of close full circle because the idea of alignment has been alluded to so much. So again, if you think about the idea of MOOCs for credit or MOOCs where it really matters what you get out of it because that knowledge that you gain in a MOOC will be brought to bear in some future course that you take. I'm thinking in particular about the Udacity Georgia Institute of Technology and AT&T collaboration, where they've developed the first MOOMS, massively open online Master of Science in Computer Science. Assessing learning really matters. This is a master's program, so the assessments have to really reflect learning and give data about the extent to which students have learned. So 4 questions I really want to get at in the next few minutes. So what do we mean by alignment? Why is it important? At what levels do we think about it? And where does instruction come in? So really, when we're talking about alignment at all, we're talking about alignment of 3 things: the learning objectives, assessments, and instructional activities. And I think you'll have no trouble seeing here where rigor fits in as well. So the learning objectives, to really think critically at the outset about what you want students to know or be able to do. Then the assessments that you design have to provide evidence of the extent to which the learning objectives are being met. And those 2 things have to go together: the objectives, the assessments, the level of rigor, etc. And then the instructional activities that are designed, what learning experiences really will move students or participants, whatever the student profile looks like, toward meeting the stated objectives and successfully completing the assessment. So the graphic is intentionally nonlinear, because you might think about one and then visit another and then say, well, do they align, and how do we throw in this other piece? But ultimately to be able to step back and feel like they all make sense together. This is important in face-to-face courses. It may be even more important in MOOCs, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But sometimes when instructors or designers struggle with assessment design, it's because the learning objectives are not really measurable. So I would just kind of throw that out there to make sure when you think about what do we want students to know and be able to do, a question you want to ask is, will I be able to measure that? Because again, I'll talk in just a minute about the cost of misalignment. Again, just with respect to rigor, because it seemed to come up so much in the first hour, I wanted to just throw out the idea that rigor, we want to have a really rigorous course, a rigorous MOOC, and have people do very rigorous activities that are appropriate. But rigor without alignment and purpose is really just sort of aimless challenge. Hard work that doesn't match the learning objectives or the goals and so forth won't make sense to students. And in terms of assessment, you won't get good information about whether they're really meeting the objectives. So Linda Susky is an assessment specialist. She used to work for Middle States as an accreditor. And one of the things she said is that how incredibly different courses would look if instructors put on their syllabus for any sort of course design information for the learners about 3 things. So what will I learn, how will I learn it, and how will I show I've learned it? And those questions really map to this graphic. So to be thinking about those things, I think, are really important. So just to reiterate, the cost of misalignment is very high, and avoiding it, though, I think is a great challenge thinking about designing for MOOCs because of the limitations in terms of the way we can really assess. But the costs, in essence, are these. So if there is misalignment, students experience a lack of clarity about what's important to learn. And we know from plenty of research that students study and prepare for what we grade. So if we say that we're going to assess on this or that, that's what students will interpret to be important. And so the alignment's important in terms of how they will prepare, how they'll study, and how they'll view the course. And so also, if we don't have alignment, then students can't really demonstrate that they've met the learning objectives, because if there's not alignment, it may very well be that they haven't met the objectives. They may have met some other sort of unstated objective or a different objective, but for them to feel like, okay, if I take this course, I'll be able to do X, Y, and Z. These are the ways I'm going to demonstrate I can do X, Y, and Z, and these are the learning experiences that are going to lead me to do that, are really important. So just to take a minute and drill down just a little bit further and talk about assessment, thinking about objectives and assessments and instructional activities at the course and the lesson level. I know Kate was talking about in the CIC MOOC that instruction per se was really sort of in 20-minute blocks, and then there were lots of other sort of ancillary activities and resources that people could consult. But in this graphic, assessments are the same. Okay, so you have assessments at the course level. You have, in many cases, the same assessment that you're working towards at the lesson level. So to be able to say this is the objective, let's say write a poem, and then know that for the assessment we want students to write a poem that reflects various things that they have learned how to do. But then when you move to the lesson level, to really think about what experiences will support students in being able to write a poem. What kind of feedback will they get? What's that look like in a MOOC? Is it at all possible to give sort of group level feedback? Do we need to rely on peer feedback, which Gary said is a very tricky kind of thing? But to think about course level and lesson level and how what the students engage in will really allow them to demonstrate their knowledge on an assessment. Research, by the way, in the 80s and 90s in K-12 education looked at teaching effectiveness. And what they found was that where there was effectiveness, it often wasn't due to poor instruction. It was due to poor alignment. So this isn't small to, to really think about how all these things fit together. And then as a last kind of thing around the lesson level in particular, so thinking about the kinds of activities that you want to design for students to do and experience, they really need to be sort of incremental building blocks that are transfer appropriate. And what we mean by that is simply, what's the best proxy experience that students can have that will allow them to, at some future point in time, leverage that knowledge in some novel way. So again, with a limited number of ways at this point that we can really assess in MOOCs, it's kind of a challenge to figure out, well, what's the best proxy that I can create for students to really practice and then demonstrate that they're learning this stuff in ways that they'll need to leverage it in the future. And so that's one thing that's important to think about. Even multiple choice questions can do that. A lot of times multiple choice questions get a bad rap, and people talk with regret about, quote, having to use multiple choice questions. But the fact of the matter is, they're some of the best, when they're well written, they're some of the best assessment tools that we have for course level assessments. So learning to write good ones is a good thing, but they can really get at some of this transfer appropriateness. So scenario kinds of questions, having people interpret graphic representations, visual literacy, you name it. There are all sorts of things that if we think creatively, even within a MOOC environment, it's possible to get good assessment of student learning. And then the other idea is this notion of scaffolding. And the whole purpose of scaffolding is to, in a construction environment, is to to support construction workers as they sort of develop the final building. And so it's the same idea in instructional design too, is to not teach the students something and then expect that they're immediately going to be able to demonstrate their learning, but that they need these sort of incremental experiences along the way that slowly build them and lead them toward being able to show what they know. And so if we could look at just one example, this is from the CIC that Kate was the lead designer on. You can see in the first row there, they had some project phases and then some incremental steps leading toward the students being able to produce the deliverable. So if you look at the first column, first row there under exploration, it says very clearly, in this phase, and there were a number of phases, you'll generate ideas for your projects, identify which idea you want to explore, and define project goals. Well, those are big things and vitally important at the outset, right? But how do they do that? And then in the steps column, it kind of breaks those down and provides students with some scaffolds for how they can work toward that and be able to produce the deliverable. So I don't know, Kate, would you add anything about the experience of having faculty think about scaffolding?
Yeah, I think deciding on the design project really changed the course of our design process. So knowing that the desired outcome of the course was a design project, it helped us to orient all the content around enabling the different project phases and breaking down the project into discrete deliverables that were due throughout the course. And so I think we were originally conceiving of this design that would be, all of Jack's content would go first, and then Catherine's content, and then Daryl's content. It was sort of more haphazard, but by orienting the course around the learning objective of having students create their own design project, and it helped us to better organize the content and better organize the enabling steps of the process to finally create the project. So it really improved our design process, and I think it speaks to the idea of scaffolding, that there were incremental steps.
Right, and with respect to assessment and scaffolding, to the extent that you can build in assessments at each of those various phases, give students a lot of feedback about how they're doing. I love to think about those kinds of formative assessments as being akin to sort of a GPS. So I drove to Philadelphia last week, and I had a GPS, and I was also driving along a highway that had lots of signs, and I was imagining, what if I had no GPS and there were no road signs? I just got in my car and drove on this pathway, and I knew where I was supposed to end up. I needed to end up in Philadelphia, but I had no sort of constant feedback about, oh, good, the mileage numbers are getting smaller, I must be getting closer, or I didn't have this, GPS voice telling me, yes, that you're going to take the next turn. And I think that's what we really have to think about when we give students feedback, whether it's, in particular, if it's formative and around these various scaffolds leading them toward the final product, that they get this sort of constant feedback about you're on the right track, or if you're not on the right track, the GPS says, recalculating, and so, okay, so you're off track, what do you need to do to get back on? The destination remains the same, the expectations can be very high as long as students get a lot of feedback about progress toward the goal. So the scaffolding is important, and feedback along the way is similarly important. So those are some issues that are really important to keep in mind. Again, I think the takeaways here are about the challenge in MOOCs is, at this point, we're kind of limited in the kinds of assessments that we can design and deliver. However, there are some that can be very rich and very rigorous and give us really good data, not only about how many students complete the course, but what's the extent to which they actually learn the content we wanted them to learn, which is really a huge thing. And then also the idea of alignment and keeping in mind that all of those things, the objectives, the assessments, and the experiences that we design have to all go together. And if they don't, the cost is high, and we could actually misuse, to the extent that students take a MOOC grade, so to speak, and then try to make decisions about what they really know about that content. If the assessments aren't well designed, then they end up misusing that information. They could be misled about what they really know about the content. So, but that's very much a function of the purpose of the MOOC. So important to keep all those variables in mind, but to strive for that alignment and do the best with the tools we have at this point. So I'd be happy to entertain questions about assessment before we would open the floor to any sort of general questions. Did you get any, Brad, that you wanted me to attend to?
There did not, nothing came in on the private chat, but I did have a question myself.
Sure.
I happen to be a digital badging advocate. Mm-hmm. And within digital badging, some of us are focused on this idea of digital badging being used as microformative feedback, mm-hmm. As a tool for being able to provide that GPS voice, to provide those signs on the highway. Right. Have you explored, or has there been any discussion with the MOOCs you've been involved in related to using digital badges within the context of a course? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of discussions using them at an institutional level, right. Across courses, but within a MOOC for providing that sort of feedback.
Yeah, I haven't specifically, although I've given thought to one in particular that I think could be really interesting, and that's with respect to peer feedback. There are lots of ways to give peer feedback, and some ways more helpful than others. And given the cultural context and the audience challenges, I think that an interesting badge that could go along with potentially all sorts of MOOCs is something around constructive feedback. And the language around it, there are lots of resources out there about how to provide feedback, about the language you use, the kinds of statements you use. So I don't know the extent to which a badge could be created around that, but I certainly imagine that it could be. And I know as if I were a MOOC instructor, or I was somebody who was looking perhaps at a student who took a MOOC, I would be encouraged if I saw that someone had achieved or gotten this micro credential around giving feedback, because I would stress a little less about what their contributions and chats would look like, about what it would mean if they were to give feedback, or even better, I could make it a requirement of the course. Take this course before we get to the part where we're going to look at made art, you have to achieve this feedback badge. So that's something that I've just given some preliminary thought to, but it's the idea, it's general and transferable across a variety of MOOCs. So sort of a long answer to your short question.
Well, I have a feeling that this question session is going to roll into the more general and broader Q&A session. So I'll take this opportunity to introduce a new participant, a new presenter that just joined in. You'll notice over in the presenter section, Daryl Bellegal, who is a distinguished professor of chemical engineering here at Penn State and a member of the faculty team who created the Creativity, Innovation, and Change MOOC. Daryl has just joined us and will be chiming in with the Q&A session here. So if you have any questions for a faculty member involved in one of these MOOCs related to design and what we've talked about today, please chime in over in the chat box. And Daryl, if you're able to turn on your microphone, you can join in audibly. Otherwise, Daryl will be able to join in the chat box, responding to questions as well. One of the things that has come up so far in the chat area was from Dave Murphy, and he and Kate have been going back and forth a little bit, and perhaps, Crystal, you might want to chime in on this. Dave made a comment, not a question, but a comment that we deal with measurable objectives and alignment as instructional designers in our everyday work outside of MOOCs. And he said, I suppose misalignment with MOOCs might be more magnified in a MOOC compared to a regular online course. Did you have any response to that, comments about the difference, the unique challenges related to alignment and assessments with a MOOC compared to what we typically do every day with online courses?
Right. Well, I think that the issue of the limited kinds of assessments that can be used is really a factor there. So even if we're attuned to the issue of alignment and recognize that it's important to maintain a certain amount of alignment, we're constrained even more than in sort of more typical online course development, I think, in terms of what assessment tools we can really leverage. And I think it requires a tremendous amount of creativity on the part of the designers to figure out, okay, so we have this handful of assessment tools that can be reasonably used in the MOOC context. So how can we leverage them in a way that's appropriate given the goal of the MOOC? Again, is it outreach? Is it brand awareness? Is it absolutely we have to get students from point A to point B because they might end up using this MOOC to leverage down the road? So yeah, I think it would be magnified. I think it's a challenge moving forward.
And one of the other questions that came up that Kate is actually responding to right now, also from Dave Murphy, related to the use of rubric. So were there any rubrics for the students to use in peer feedback? And my addition to the question, were there any unique challenges with creating a rubric for students? Often we create rubrics for our own use as practiced individuals in using, reading, and implementing rubrics. Were there rubrics used across any of the MOOCs that you're familiar with or you were involved in, and how did it go?
Yeah, so for the Art MOOC, we provided rubrics basically addressing 6 different dimensions of the original works of art, composition being one, quality. I can't remember all of them. I think I had mentioned earlier that we based those rubrics off of pre-existing rubrics for a 3-credit art course, and wound up having to scale them back a little bit to hopefully kind of recast them in a way that was a little bit more usable given the language diversity. And it also involved reducing from a 5-point scales to 3-point scales, and a little bit of cleaning up of language to be a little more encouraging. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting about MOOCs is that we've talked a little bit about rigor here and there, but we approached this as an outreach effort and sort of deliberately made the choice that we were going to, well, the faculty member who taught the course made the choice that it was just going to be a little bit more encouraging, I guess, by nature than her 3-credit classes, equivalent classes. So I do think that the rubrics were beneficial just because I can envision in a situation where absent the rubrics, there'd be total confusion over what there was to do. But what we tried to do with the rubrics was provide specific language that associated with one of the 3 scores, the 1, 2, or 3 scores, and then had an open text field at the bottom of the peer assessment submission to allow for other feedback for students on their peers. I do think that we aspire to revisit the rubrics just based on, again, how polarizing the peer assessments were. I think the tricky part for our team is going to be exactly how do we change the rubrics to address some of the issues, because we don't exactly know what the nature of the issues were. If there was confusion around how to use the rubrics, or if it had more to do with novices assessing one another. And if it's the latter, that's a pretty big challenge. I think you can have more or less artfully designed rubrics, but asking complete novices to peer assess one another and their works of art, that's going to be daunting for some of them, regardless.
Thanks. So we had a question come in for Daryl. Hopefully it looks like, Daryl, you have your microphone enabled there. So a question for you as a faculty member. Why did you need an instructional designer in this process? What was the value of bringing an instructional designer into this process? And related to that, did you have much experience? Did the 3 faculty within this MOOC have much experience with online courses already, or MOOC experiences? Did you have that experience coming to the table, or were you lacking that experience, and that was one of the reasons that perhaps an instructional designer had a role?
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for having me on. We all did have lots of experience teaching, and Catherine and myself had online experience. Jack had online experience. We'd all done this sort of thing before. but not at the level of a MOOC, not even close. And so as we were pulling together our various material, we found ourselves running in circles at times. So Kate Miffett was our instructional designer, and she was critical in pulling together a streamlined way for us to interact to develop this MOOC and to give it a spine, in this case, which was the project, and to get the course rolling. So it was very important to our project, our MOOC, to have somebody who could guide that whole process.
And perhaps we have a response to that or a perspective from the instructional designers sitting in the room.
Yeah, I think one of the other additional assets to the Creativity MOOC design team was we invited a professor of theater to help with the scripting and on-camera presence for the lecture production, for the video lectures. And that she was just an incredible asset to the team. She fit right in with the group, and I think Gerald could attest to the process that he underwent to getting his scripts cut. So I think bringing a design perspective, whether that person's an instructional designer or a consultant in some other capacity or area of expertise, the design perspective helps to, I think, focus the content to its most essential parts and orient it towards the objective or goal of the project. And it's a nice balance to the subject matter experts on the team.
Let me add to that a bit. You mentioned something, Kate, about process. And the process of putting together a MOOC is not something we had done before. So there were some simple ideas that Kate brought, and also Susan Russell, who she mentioned, who is the Penn State laureate for the coming year. One of the things that Kate brought in very early on is, how do we tie all these pieces together, and then what is the objective of each piece, what is the content of each piece, and then what is the evidence that we will use to show that the students have learned it. Those three little pieces were extraordinarily valuable in helping us design the course. And Kate mentioned she contacted Susan Russell, who was able to help us. Susan helped us with the individual videos in terms of, once again, a very simple system. She wanted us to give very short videos with a quick story, a problem statement, a solution to the problem, and an action item. Very simple steps, and they both helped keep us on track with that, with our content.
Thanks, Daryl. So one of the other questions that's come in the background, and this one actually came in very early in the session, but I thought it would be more appropriate to be asked right now, which was, did you learn anything during your MOOC design experience that you have been able to translate into your more traditional experience? Very often we focus on the fact that so many of the best practices, I'll do air quotes over here, best practices in traditional online course design, which has been around for quite some time, we're very familiar with, a lot of research related to how many of those best practices relate to MOOC design. But is there anything that you've learned during MOOC design that perhaps has influenced your traditional work?
Are you asking me, Daryl?
No, well, anyone, quite honestly, anyone here in the room. I see faces mulling over, so it looks like either Kate or Gary are about to jump in.
I can start with the response. From a process standpoint, I think I learned a lot more about project management when there are a lot of resources and moving parts. So in my previous experience developing online courses, there was a much more systematic approach. The expectations were pretty clearly outlined. The timelines were pretty consistent across courses, so they were much easier to manage. With the MOOC development process, there were an institutional strategy group that we were accountable to, then the college leadership, working with a big faculty team who had support staff, like I said, of undergraduate and graduate students. So having a diverse team, we contracted with WPSU, which is our public broadcasting group on campus, to produce the videos. So we had a producer that we were working with. I think navigating the resources and managing the timeline to have the course ready on time was just a lot more complex than for the development of a typical online course, from my perspective.
Yeah, I would say that it may not be exactly learning something to bring back, but we for sure are incorporating media that we created for the MOOC back into regular 3-credit, kind of credit-bearing online courses. And I think that, the lessons learned, the most obvious lessons learned that we had more to do with production approaches and kind of the value of 3-camera shoots, more high-end video shoots, and when to target certain topics for that kind of media treatment versus anything on the pedagogical side. I think some of that was a function of we were working with a professor who is the lead faculty for an online program. So, I think the story is different if we were working with a faculty member who was new to online. I think there would have been much greater opportunity to take what was learned in the MOOC and bring it back. But she's, and I think it was helpful in a lot of ways for us. She's a very seasoned online instructor, and so most of our value that we can bring back to our course portfolio has to do with having much higher end media assets now to incorporate.
So one of the interesting things that we discussed yesterday during the planning session was related to the tension between budget for the MOOC, expectations for the MOOC, desires for the MOOC, and what was practical, particularly from the design perspective. I see this as a particularly salient point given the fact that MOOCs right now do not fall within our more established revenue producing model. They're kind of outside here, and they have more diffuse objectives, such as you've mentioned a few times, bringing eyes to the university and adding to the reputation. What were the design struggles related to budget that you might run into in a MOOC that you do not traditionally run into in a credit-bearing online course? Or I could frame it in a little bit different way. Were there any issues that had to be navigated related to faculty expectations with the design of a MOOC and what was feasible given the budget and the design parameters, how much time you had and the like?
I would say from my experience, the design shop I worked in to develop online courses, one of the goals was to develop capacity in the faculty members themselves. So often when we are creating lecture content or videos in the course, part of our goal was to empower the faculty member to do some of that themselves. So we would give them a camera, they would create their own videos, but the audience is very different, and so given that, I think the production value in the MOOC was much higher, less driven by budget and more just by the objective of the project itself. And I think the visibility of it mandated a little bit higher of a production value. And while we could do that, or maybe in some cases should do that in a traditional online course development process, part of the goal there is to develop the capacity in the faculty members, so if they need to swap out a lecture or make a change, that proficiency is part of what we're aiming towards. So I think that in some ways addresses that tension a bit.
Thanks. Crystal, you mentioned at one point the idea of development of these assessments to bring meaning to MOOCs beyond the non-for-credit MOOC space, traditional MOOC space, and
Right.
possibly integration into the broader university higher education platform that, again, that's a little bit more established. Was that perspective in place during the design process where you were changing the way that you were designing with thoughts forward into what could be done with this course outside of the MOOC, perhaps even pulling pieces of it apart to use in other online courses, reusing those videos in order to make it a better value proposition for designing this MOOC, so you could reuse those videos in a more traditional course where you might have some additional assessments outside of what Coursera may be able to do?
I'm going to intentionally bounce that to Gary and Kate, but for this reason. So thinking about, I mean, just to make sure that I'm spinning the question correctly and that we can kind of clarify. So were some of the assessment items or the learning assets or media assets that were created, did they have potential use, or was it considered to be potentially useful down the road to the extent that something like the MOOC you created could be used in a more for-credit kind of environment if the goals and purposes changed? Is that correct, Brad?
Yeah.
How you're thinking?
Yeah. So again, on the media side, we definitely had, I think that was by design from the beginning, this idea that we could create things that would eventually be folded back into our regular online portfolio. In terms of the quizzes and the different assessment approaches, it's trickier. So we don't really have quizzes, like multiple choice quizzes as part of the courses that come closest to what the MOOC was. And again, the MOOC is a kind of a lighter weight version of a 16-week, kind of full 3-credit course. The assignments are very similar to some of the assignments in courses. What would be interesting if we had Anna, who was our faculty member here, if she were here to speak on it, what would be interesting would be to find out relative quality-wise, how things looked, or if there was anything that she learned in the process of teaching the MOOC that she would use to change those assignments. I don't know the answer to that one. Knowing her and how she's constantly tweaking her courses, I would guess that something probably changed, but it wasn't anything planned where we were going to take those assignments and the nature of those assignments and bring them back over.
Thanks. So there's one last question for you, Crystal, related to the design of these multiple choice questions. You kind of slipped in there as you were describing it. A well-designed multiple choice question can be so powerful and so useful. Do you have any recommendations or quick tips, best practices, particularly within a MOOC environment, given the more limited tools that are within this more closed platform than what we're used to? Do you have any tips for writing those good multiple choice questions?
Yeah, so I think the first tip is that there are strategies and guidelines for writing good questions, and they're available at a lot of institutions. For example, Penn State, at the Schreier Institute, we have links to guidelines, and there are lots of them. And when I work with faculty, I tend to focus on a dozen really good ones that I think of as being low-hanging fruit. Collectively they make a great difference in the quality of multiple choice questions, but there are others besides just those 12. So given that, we have just a couple minutes left, I would refer anybody who's interested to our website at Penn State, the Schreier Institute for Teaching Excellence. The University of Texas at Austin has some great resources on writing these assessments. And in particular, the University of Oregon has, I think, a great resource around writing higher level multiple choice questions. And anybody who's interested could get some great template ideas for writing good questions from those sources. More generally, I would say this is that assessments themselves are not valid or invalid, but the scores that are yielded by assessments are valid or invalid. And the ways that we end up with valid scores are by rising to a particular challenge as question writers or quiz or test writers, and that is to write the questions in such a way that the people who know the answers get them correct, and that the people who don't know the answers don't get them correct. So in large part, this is a matter of writing questions in a way that people who don't have knowledge can't guess the right answer. Because if you don't have knowledge, but you can guess the right answer, then your score is not valid. Your score doesn't really speak to what you know. It's deceiving, and then we make decisions based on those scores, and then the uses of the scores become invalid. The decisions we make are not valid decisions because we have invalid data. So honestly, I think the best thing we could say, aside from kind of referring you to people to resources, is to pay particular attention to question quality. And that is make sure the questions are clear, to make sure that they're proofread by people who know the content. Question clarity is huge. And in particular, I would offer this about, in a multiple choice question, you have sort of the stem of the question, and then you have the options, and one of those is the right answer, and then the others are the distractors. And those distractors need to be very thoughtfully considered. And MOOCs, I think, offer some interesting fodder for thinking about those distractors, because they can come from much like more traditional online courses too, but the distractors really should come from misconceptions that appear in the discussions. They can come from incorrect quiz responses. If lots of people are missing quiz questions, then come time for a maybe higher stakes quiz or whatever. But those distractors should be plausible, and they should come from sort of the context of conversations and formative assessments that are happening in the course. So at any rate, I think that's a way that MOOCs, again, much like more traditional online courses, that can really be leveraged so that people can write really good questions. So at any rate, there are places to find good guidelines, and it should be taken seriously, though, especially to the extent that really tracking learning per se, not just participation, although participation is huge in some, depending on the goal, but if learning is what really matters, then those should be taken really seriously.
Thank you. And participants will notice that I put the link to the web link to the Schreier Institute tool for multiple choice items.
Thank you.
There in the chat box. You can click on that. And we'll also at some point be posting these recordings, so if you want to come back to it later, these links are live in the recordings as well. So with that, our time is up. So first I want to thank Kate, Gary, Crystal, and Daryl for being here with us today and providing their knowledge, their experience, and sharing it with all of us. And on behalf of that team, I also want to thank the participants, those of you who have been here and been participating and joining in the discussion. I hope that you'll join us again throughout the week. Each day this week at 3 p.m. we'll be having another session of MOOC by Design. We have already done the planning. Today was design. Tomorrow we will be having a session on development. Thursday we'll have a session on delivery. And finally on Friday we will have a session on evaluation. So I hope to see you there for each one of those sessions, and I will be there joining you. So with that, on behalf of our entire team, thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.